Hello, my name is Steve Swain, and I'm a professor of music at Dartmouth College and also the director of the Montgomery Fellows Program. I sit here in Quechee, Vermont, on the ancestral homelands of the Western Abenaki, who were and are part of the Wabanaki Confederation. The Montgomery Fellows Program brings exceptional people to an exceptional place. That place, of course, is Dartmouth. And normally we would have our fellow with you in person at that exceptional place and staying at the Montgomery House. Both the fellowship and the house are because of the generosity of Kenneth Montgomery, class of 1925, and his wife, Harl. We will bring this fellow to campus later on, but right now I'd like to introduce somebody who actually works with that person. Nathaniel J Domini is a professor of anthropology in the department here at Dartmouth. He studies the behavior, ecology, and functional morphology of humans and non-human primates. Nate works to integrate what he sees with analysis in order to better understand how and why adaptive shifts occur during primate evolution. Nate came to Dartmouth in 2010, and he's a dear friend of mine as we work together on the Society of Fellows. So Nate, you take it away and introduce our fellow today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Steve. Let me begin by saying that Professor Ikram has a bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr College and an MPhil and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. After earning her doctorate, she joined the faculty of the American University in Cairo, where she rose to the rank of Distinguished University Professor in 2017, the same year that she held a courtesy appointment as Extraordinary Professor at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Now, I gotta ask, is Extraordinary Professor something that goes on your business card? Is everyone else an ordinary professor? I don't know. I want to know. In any case, 2017 was also the year of her election into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an extremely prestigious honor. But even more impressive is being named a finalist for the Dartmouth Medal, which comes not from Dartmouth, but from the American Library Association. It was commissioned by Dartmouth in 1974 at the suggestion of our college librarian, hence the name. It honors an outstanding reference work. Now, I could go on and on about her record as a prolific and distinguished scholar of Egyptology and mummification, by which I mean the how, when, and what of it, with a special focus on the natural history and cosmology of human-animal interactions. But I want to pivot from convention and speak a little more personally. I've known Salima for 15 years. We've attended conferences together, and we've shared meals, and we've celebrated with champagne at her home in Cairo and numerous other venues. And we've collaborated on a research project that's one of the highlights of my career. And of course, I've seen her on countless television programs. And what I want to tell you is that her on-screen persona is the real authentic her. Her poise and enthusiasm are absolutely genuine, and it is extremely effective at public outreach and communication. But this success can be awkward sometimes, as when she plays herself in a Hollywood movie. It's called Luxor. Check it out. I mean, think about it. Do you recite lines written by a scriptwriter, or do you just improvise and be yourself across numerous takes? It must be very awkward to play oneself in a work of fiction. Anyway, my point is that very few of us do public-facing scholarship, and virtually none of us do it as well as Professor Ikram. It is a vitally important but underappreciated aspect of being a professor, and I just want to acknowledge it and express my admiration. She is a professional role model, and I can't wait to watch her talk.
Thank you, Nate, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Steve, for the invitation. I'm very sorry I'm not there in the flesh because it would be so much more fun, but inshallah, next time. So for the interim, let me begin. I'm going to be talking about museums in Egypt, history, nationalism, and economy. Now, the English word museum comes from the Greek museum, which designated a temple to the Muses, the patron goddesses of the arts. And this was actually not what we think of as a museum today, but more of a gathering place for intellectuals, and sometimes for them to gather together not only ideas, but actually objects. The first museum was founded in Alexandria by Ptolemy I in about 280 BC. And this was a meeting place for intellectuals. And in fact, this was a huge, huge library associated with the museum, as well as odd artifacts from not just Egypt, but other parts of the world. The museum suffered a great deal over time and was ultimately destroyed. And it was only in 2001 where it regrew and became the Great Library of Alexandria that we see today. But all this serves really as an introduction to say that Egypt was one of the places, or in fact the place, where museums, as we see them today, were developed. And this tradition of museum continues into the present day. And indeed, in the 21st century, it is much more of a thing in Egypt to build museums, to have museums, and to have people visit museums. Now, the Library of Alexandria does have an actual physical of what we would call a museum in it. And this was to give its visitors a glimpse of consecutive eras of Egypt's history. And this is something that all museums do. They want people to learn history. They are there to educate. They are also there to expose people to a vast range of ideas and sometimes culture, not just their own, and also historically. The other thing that the Bibliotheca Alexandrina wants to do is encourage young people to engage with the past, both by objects, but also through programs. And this idea of education ties in, of course, to the original idea of what a museum was supposed to do. And these, though, are elements that you will see in the museum development and the history of development of museums in Egypt from the 19th century onward to the present day. Now, Egypt has many different kinds of museums. The open air museums, which is every single site you go and visit, whether it is the Great Pyramids at Giza or Karnak Temple. So that is one genre of museums. We have museums all throughout the country. Some of them are very specialized in terms of being just for one object, like the Khufu Boat Museum. Others are historic houses, such as the Kulthum Museum. And we also have things that are not related directly to antiquities, but fine art museums, the zoo, geology museums, and aquariums. So we do have quite a few museums located in Egypt. But today, I'm going to really focus on the evolution and change and what in the present day people are thinking about in terms of museums and museology. And I will start with the Egyptian Museum, which is, of course, the centerpiece for Cairo and where most Egyptian antiquities are held. Now, this museum has quite a complicated history. It has stood in its present site for more than 100 years, but that's not where it started off. It started off here in a room in a palace. It then moved to an area that became a converted warehouse. From there, it moved to yet another palace, and then finally to the building in which it is standing today, in 1902, and then it is in the process now of moving once again, with its objects being divided primarily between two museums in Cairo: the Grand Egyptian Museum, scheduled to open next year in November in 2022, and the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, which has already opened. So we're going to trace this history and see how museums and what they are emerged in Egypt as part of nationalism and how they evolved and changed. Now, the first museum that we have in Egypt was called the Antikhana, which is basically the house or place or area for old things. It was founded by Muhammad Ali, the Khedive of Egypt, in 1835 at the urging of Sheikh Rifa al-Tahtawi, and this was located in Ezbekeya in one of the royal residences. Now, now Rifa al-Tahtawi had traveled abroad. He was very interested in Egypt, even though he was sort of his main focus was Islamic doctrine and law. He had been to Europe, and there he was told, many people asked him about his own history, and he realized that he didn't know so much. And so when he came back, this became one of his big crusades to learn more about Egyptian history in order to educate his own people as well as foreigners who were coming to the country. So the first curator and indeed inspector of archaeological sites was a man called Yusuf Zia Effendi. And we think that maybe Muhammad Ali didn't just found this museum or sort of finance it because of great nationalist ideas, but there might have been a tiny touch of rivalry because the Egina National Museum was opened in 1829, and Muhammad Ali had been born and brought up in Thessaloniki, and so maybe he had a little sense of let's be rivals here and get something going in Egypt to show its greatness and grandeur. Now, this collection was in Ezbekeya for some time, except unfortunately, Muhammad Ali's successors didn't quite see the great importance of objects that were Egyptian and pharaonic being in Egypt. They understood that lots of people admired them, and sometimes they started to use them to grease the wheels of diplomacy. So if someone came from abroad, from France or Germany or Austria, Pasha or Austria, wherever, if there was going to be a trade agreement, or in fact, what they really wanted in Egypt was technology being brought in, so modern Western technology being traded, often for antiquities. So in about 1855, Muhammad Said Pasha gave much of what was left in the Antikhana to Maximilian of Austria in exchange for technology and to grease the wheels of diplomacy. And this, in fact, this collection that used to be in the Antikhana now forms the core of the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. So this is a moment where the ideas of nationalism or history gave way to more commercial nationalism and a desire to advance Egypt forward, and basically thinking of objects or whatever was in a museum as a commodity. And this is a theme that reoccurs throughout the history of museums in Egypt, though not in quite such a dramatic manner. The founder of the next museum, curiously, was a Frenchman, Auguste Mariette Pasha. And he came to Egypt. He was sent here by the Louvre to collect objects, and in particular, Coptic manuscripts, which he did quite well. But when he came here, he fell in love with Egypt, and he fell under the spell of Egyptian antiquities. So he wound up leaving the Louvre and living here and being established as a collector and a scholar, and he was then appointed Director of Historic Monuments, and he started off a new museum, which was the Great Museum of Bulac. And he, Mariette, was really one of the greatest supporters of Egyptian antiquities and the fact that Egyptian antiquities should remain in Egypt. So he excavated, he collected, he curated, and of course was a great scholar. The first museum was the Bulak Museum, which was rather grudgingly, the land was grudgingly given to him by the ruler of Egypt, and it is on the banks of the Nile, as you can see here, which is beautiful, except that the Nile floods, so this wasn't really the ideal location for a museum. So this museum was built here with Mariette's house with a little garden, and this the garden had space for Finette, his pet gazelle. The museum was constructed and was perhaps the first neo-pharaonic building in Egypt, which you can see here with all of the elements of Egyptian architecture. So very plainly telling the public or whoever was going to visit that this was an Egyptian pharaonic entity, with little elements of more Islamic architecture here in the Ablak that one sees being echoed. But this gives a sense of both the outside and the inside of the museum was being used. The museum garden is very much an integrated part of the museum, often because, of course, Egyptian sculptures were located externally, and also because there's not much space for some of the more monumental sculptures inside. Now, interestingly, when Mariette was founding his museum, he didn't have that much of a formal mission statement, not like the one we saw with the Biblioteca Museum, but he very clearly stated in his, this is what I want this museum to be, that it should be Egyptians and foreigners who came here. And he really stressed the Egyptians because he wanted people to have a sense of their past. His guidebook was translated into Arabic by one of the students of Al-Tahtawi, Mr. Abdullah Abdel Soud. So right from its inception, the museum was made accessible to the educated from whatever background, whether they were foreign or Egyptian or Turkish or whatever. Now, his arrangements in the museum were interesting too, because of course, some of it was done chronologically and the rest of it was done thematically. But some of the vitrines, some of the windows had these sort of mishmashes, which are aesthetically appealing, or were perhaps so in the 19th century. It's a bit sort of Victorian clutter for the modern eye. But Mariette described this as absolutely useless to science, but it will catch the attention of people. And indeed, often these sort of ideas that look more like the Cabinet de Curiosité do attract attention because you keep wanting to see, well, what else is in there? The way the Bulac Museum was organized was, section was art, chronological, and then the other bit was thematic, so how people lived, what their religion was, what funerary customs were. So really it was a museum of the civilization of Egypt on every level. And that the only other museum that did that was Berlin at the time. Now, Mariette was very proud of the fact that our museum here was not just filled with pretty objects, but these were objects that had been excavated, they were provenanced, they were contextualized, and thus they gave us a lot more information about the ancient Egyptians, and therefore were of greater value for both scholars and anyone else who wanted to visit this museum. So here, this is part of the funerary section, and it's quite interesting because if you look at pictures over time, one can see how the museum initially had more space, and as discoveries were being made, things were being pulled in and it became increasingly crowded over time. This is the same sort of funerary section. This here appears in the next image, so this is what happens in the rest of the area. Once the royal mummies were found, they were discovered in the late 19th century, in the 1880s. They were brought into the Bulak Museum, and this already crowded space became even more crowded. But as people pointed out, Mariette had moved on since then, but Maspero and others said, well, this is very good because more people will come to see the museum. And it was a moment where Egyptians again became re-interested in seeing and engaging with their past because they were looking at the pharaohs who had once ruled them. Now, the Bulak Museum, as I mentioned, was by the Nile. And indeed, it got flooded periodically, but this time in 1878, there was a huge flood, which took 2 years to really mop up, and it reopened in 1880. Now, during this whole time, the directors of the museum had been asking the rulers of Egypt to give them a bigger, better museum, which had been promised, but nothing much happened. But one good thing was, with this flood, a side benefit was that there were temporary, money was set aside, a building was initiated, and in 1890, all of the collection was moved to a palace, once again, belonging to the Khedive Ismail in Giza, which was on the other side of the river, further to the south, closer to the pyramids. And here, this was a much more European-style palace, with a little bit of arabesque elements involved. So it was a very different feel and space. And also for visitors, it must have been a change because there they had been going to a building that was far more modest. It was definitely a museum which expected visitors. Now, to move to a palace, which was a royal residence, meant that for people to interact with the whole issue of visiting was slightly different psychologically. Though this was treated just like the old museum had been. But one wonders a bit about visitors coming here and maybe having a little bit more of a sort of trepidation at going to visit a museum, because this was not, of course, something that every Tom, Dick or Harry did. Now, the majority of people who were working in the museum were Europeans. There were, in terms of management, in terms of other jobs, we had more Egyptians, of course. And one of them was Ahmed Pasha Kamal, who is supposed to be sort of father of modern Egyptian Egyptology. Although he was very well trained, he spent a lot of his time not getting proper jobs. He had studied in Germany and with Germans and was fluent in German, so he was doing a lot of just German language teaching. His first position at the Egyptian Museum was the Secretaire Mutargim, where he was basically a translator. But finally, he was given a position of curator and then assistant keeper at the museum, and he retired in 1914. But it just sort of highlights that initially there were not very many, if any, Egyptian scholars involved in the museum after its initial foundation. But with Kamal, he really pushed for more people to come, and the dynamics changed a bit. These are some images that we have of the Giza Museum, and we can see in the back, you have all of the stele installed, and it's much more like, which it was indeed, visiting a private house of a collector rather than a more formalized museum. Some larger halls were more museum-like, as we see here. But it was a different kind of aesthetic that the objects were enjoying, with none of the elements of ancient Egyptian architecture to contextualize them. So lots and lots of mummies again. Now, in 1902, the new Egyptian Museum was completed, and construction here was taking place between 1897 and 1902. And this is the great museum in Tahrir. And Mariette had died before this was totally finished, and he was then buried here. His body still rests in the museum, where we can see in his sarcophagus. And once I was very fortunate, I was at a conference where they dragged the lid off and you could peer in and see the great Mariette's remains. And he is surrounded by the busts of notable Egyptologists from all over the world, Egypt including, of course. Here, the arrangement of the artifacts echoed very much what the Bulac Museum had. And so you had them all set chronologically down on the first ground floor. And then on the first floor, the American second floor, you have them arranged thematically. As groups of artifacts were found, one complete burial, they would be put into a room by themselves. So you have those in addition. And of course, when Tutankhamun was found, they had to scurry to empty up lots of place so that Tutankhamun could be displayed with all of his objects in one location. So this museum was a very important place for the Egyptians as a place to be, to visit their history, to visit their ancestors. But it was really more visited, probably, on the whole, by foreigners. And this is something that seemed to have become increasingly common post the 1950s. Here's just the plan of the museum, where the bottom floor is all chronology, top floor is sort of thematic, and then Tutankhamun took up all of this once he arrived, and then there are other people who were grave goods, complete assemblages were kept here. So this was a museum that was rare here because they were paying attention always to archaeological context. They were always trying to keep things together that were found together, or else then thematically could be grouped together. So unlike many other museums throughout the rest of the world, attention was paid to where things are from and how they fit into the bigger picture, because the overarching idea was to understand ancient Egypt as fully as possible, and to some extent to link it to the people who inhabited Egypt today. Now, this museum our museum is quite a large one, but it has become increasingly full of objects. Again, as people excavate, it becomes fuller and fuller and fuller. So in the 1990s, there was the idea that some of these artifacts should be moved to another museum that was more modern, more up to date, have more technology, have more, have air conditioning in every room and have lighting, etc. Because remember, this museum was founded in 1902. So it didn't have all the mod cons. Things were added over the years in an ad hoc manner. Now, the other thing was, of course, tourism was on the increase. And for Egypt, tourism is a very important part of the economy. And therefore, to be able to accommodate tourists and to give them a good visitor experience, as well as to protect the objects, this idea of the Grand Egyptian Museum was not only born, but supported and slowly has been coming to fruition since then. Now, the Grand Egyptian Museum is located in Giza, and the whole point was so that you could have a connection with the pyramids of Giza and then some of the objects that came from there, as well as everything else. Because in a way, Giza was the starting point in terms of being very visible in terms of Egyptian history. So the Grand Egyptian Museum, as one can see here, occupies a massive amount of space. And it is not supposed to just be a museum. It's supposed to have, maybe in a way, we're going back to the idea of the museum. It's supposed to have a conference center. It's supposed to have places where scholars can meet in smaller groups, where workshops can be carried out, where people of all ages can be educated, as well as element of commercial ventures with cafes and restaurants, and their thoughts of having a movie theater which specializes in historic movies, ancient Egypt or for parts of Islamic culture, etc. But it's a very, very vast area and has taken a very long time to build. And construction has been ongoing since, indeed, the late 90s, and is finally drawing to completion now, even as we speak. More and more things have been moved from the Tahrir Museum to the Grand Egyptian Museum. And this is its facade, echoing the pyramids that are nearby. It's a massive amount of space inside with... And this gives you another idea. This is what it looks like right now, with basically lists of kings appearing on the facade. The way it's built is that even massive, large statues can be accommodated inside, such as this one of Ramses II, who is, I'm afraid I can't remember how tall, but extremely tall, over 6 meters in height. And he is accommodated here, and he was used to stand outside next to the Ramses train station, but was moved here for safety and security, and also to make sure that pollutants, etc., do not affect the stone any longer. He is the first thing that one sees when one enters the museum proper, welcoming party, as it were. And then we have this grand staircase, where you will see first there's access to temporary exhibitions here, and then this grand staircase that is being constructed, which will have statues from all periods of Egyptian histories. And as one goes up here, it's the idea is that it's an unrolling timeline to introduce people to some of the more monumental pieces of sculpture associated with Egyptian royalty through time. This is the top view, and then it does link to the pyramids here visually. And in addition, there's a desire to contextualize, as we had in the old museum. There's a garden that one can view from this viewing area, where there will be flora of ancient Egypt. We are trying to push for a little area where we might even get the fauna of ancient Egypt, but it gives you an idea that the things that you see within the images of plants, of animals, you will actually see them in the flesh, as it were, outside. Now, the large part of this museum is going to hold the Tutankhamun material, all of it. It's going to all be on display, and as well as a section that will be much more thematic. So you will have the chronological great work of art in a very limited way in this museum, and you will have more themes of writing or food and drink. Different aspects of daily life will also be appearing in this museum. Recently, another addition was made to the museum. This boat, which is, belongs to King Cheops or Khufu, is at the Giza Plateau right next to the pyramid in the find spot, just above its find spot. However, the building is not very sound any longer. It has suffered a great deal over time. So for the safety of the boat, it has been decided that it will be moved to the Grand Egyptian Museum, together with its twin that is being excavated right now. And recently we had this large foray. The boat was, they did 3 practices, and then they used a lot of technology to move this boat. And now it is standing in a specially built space within the grounds of the Grand Egyptian Museum. Now, the Grand Egyptian Museum, again, has taken on, in a way, the personality of the pyramids. It has become a great national project, as well a symbol of unification for all Egyptians, whether they are associated with working on it or not. The idea is that this is the biggest museum in the world. It is showcasing pharaonic history. It is something for national pride. It is also a place for Egyptians to learn about their past. And it is also a way to finance Egypt, because increasingly museums, as I said, because tourism plays such a huge role in the Egyptian economy, museums are key for this as well. And their economic role is being now, at this moment in time, much more exploited than it has ever been before, partly because of the increasing popularity of ancient Egypt, brought about not just because ancient Egypt is fabulous, but also by the fact that there are so many more TV shows that are not just documentaries, but things like Netflix specials that focus on ancient Egypt, which has brought in even more of the viewing public. And previously, most people came from Europe and the United States, but now Egypt has become so sort of hot, and also travel has become so much easier. People are coming from South and Central America, they're coming from China, India, and so all of these places. And therefore, again, there's a huge boom in the number of people coming here and what this means for the economy. The last museum in Cairo, which is funneling the material off from the Cairo Museum, is the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, the NEMEC. And this has actually featured quite prominently in the news recently, because primarily of the fact that the royal mummies have moved from the Cairo Museum to this one. Again, this is a massive project, but not quite the same size as the Grand Egyptian Museum. It has supposed to have a huge number of objects. And interestingly, the initial brief for this was Egyptian audiences. It is in a part of Cairo that is a bit more vernacular. And the thought was that it would be placed there because it's a historic place, which in fact it's located in one of the first Islamic capitals of Egypt was founded. But the idea was to bring more Egyptians into museums because they weren't going that much. And it was quite interesting that this was the main brief. It's supposed to be the first museum of civilization in the Arab world, but in fact, there was an earlier incarnation in the mid-20th century. But that one was much smaller and depended a great deal on models and dioramas, unlike this one. So this is supposed to cover the history of Egypt from prehistory to the present day. And it is supposed to be very multidisciplinary and thematic. So ideas like, you will trace the idea of writing from the pharaonic time to now, or education from the pharaonic time to now. So the nitty-gritty of Egyptian civilization through the ages, through 5,000 years of history, is basically being brought to you in this museum. It is quite large. It too has, a lot of places for lectures and conferences. And this is, again, taken from the museum's website, where they want to have it as a place of worldwide communications on Egyptian civilization, etc. Now, for the current moment, it has the themes have been well established, and so you can see things having to do with tools through time. And this is the pharaonic window, where you can see all of the objects that are used for architecture, and then this leads you to the section on architecture, where we have architectural elements as well as photographs. And this sort of theme continues on from the pharaonic period into basically now, in some instances, or at least into the recent present. And quite often it's very nice, because in fact this museum has attracted a lot of local attention. It is very nice, if one's doing the fly on the wall eavesdropping, to hear people saying, oh, I remember my great grandfather told me about such and such, and they had this tool, or they used it in this way, or even carpenters coming in and saying, oh, look, we still use these. So it's very nice to have that sense that people are finding a continuity to their past, a linkage to their past, whether it is technology or whether it is food. Here we have some ancient bread that has been preserved from Egypt. And as I said, this goes into the current day. So ideas about religion are traced through. And this is a canopy that was used in more recent times, in the 19th century. As well as having clothing from Bedouin ladies and jewelry, etc., and people, more contemporary ideas as to what is going on. Now, the royal mummies are, in fact, a main draw for this museum. And I think one of the reasons that this museum in particular became so popular is because of the royal mummies. They were brought, the plan was to move them from the Cairo Museum to this museum, because it is indeed a much more modern construction with proper lights and climate control. And so what the idea, the concept for the mummies here was, instead of just having a bunch of them in one room, was to have slightly more individual chambers in an underground section of this museum. And what has made it so popular is the fact that there was a great spectacle attached to it. Earlier this year, there was the Parade of the Mummies, and the buzz it engendered was huge. Whether people were being critical of it here or abroad and saying, oh, this is, it's really tacky, moving dead bodies, it should be done quietly, what is all this fuss? Whereas other people were saying, this is magnificent, we are paying attention to the rulers of Egypt, we're giving them their due. So whichever side of the fence one came down on, it was really quite a spectacle that was designed, and it was designed to boost tourism and the economy. Unfortunately, COVID made it a very complicated thing, but it also was, on one hand, tourism and economy, which had a long-term effect, and national pride. And that is very interesting, because after this whole show, I was traveling through different places in Egypt, because I had excavations, and it was incredible how everyone, whether they were working for the Antiquity Service or they were someone in the street, talked about this grand procession and how much it meant to them, and how that, even if they were living in cities far distant from Cairo, they were determined to go to visit the mummies in their new home. And it's sort of recharged people and rekindled interest amongst Egyptians of all walks of life, from all areas of Egypt, in their own history, which was really one of the goals of the whole exercise. And it is quite an interesting thing to see how these events associated with antiquities are recharging a sense of national pride, helping to craft a fresh identity, or at least emphasize the identity that has been becoming a bit sort of stagnant, and people are feeling a sense of ownership of their past and a great sense of achievement, because world attention is on Egypt for doing something good and important, and contributing to civilization, not just now, but for over 5,000 years. And so that is something that really has been a great pull for Egypt. Now, some people might say that it was a bit neophronic or kitsch or Disney, but even though it might have been all or some of those, depending on one's perspective, it was a very emotional thing, and it was a grand spectacle. Cecil B. DeMille would have been in awe. And it certainly did employ a lot of people, and hopefully the end result will bring in a lot of people. 27 mummies were moved from the Cairo Museum to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in these specially constructed vehicles. The roads had been put right before. It was all very carefully crafted and well rehearsed. And you can see it was during Corona, because here is President Sisi watching a lot of the parade. And then he went out to greet the mummies, the kings of Egypt, in person. So it was a very emotional thing. And the soldiers, modern soldiers, fired a 21-gun salute when the mummies arrived, just as they would for a living head of state. So it was a very emotive event, as you can see here, with lots of stuff going on. And in fact, it was quite nice. It wasn't just going on in Cairo. They also shot scenes and had events going on simultaneously in Luxor and Alexandria and other parts of the country. So really, it was a place of unification. The display of mummies is done in a very respectful way, and it is in this gallery where you descend, and in this rotunda you can see the mummies sort of circling. One goes in, there's an initial text, and then one can visit the mummies. Now, in these display, it's different from the previous displays because there is a greater attempt to contextualize. They are now being founded with some of the grave goods that were with them. And because in the last mummy room, that was the only time in the Egyptian Museum where contextualization was not the focus in the two new mummy rooms, because one has instead just the mummies lined up, and it was very tomb-like. Here it is still tomb-like, but you have the objects belonging to the individual that were found with that individual. So the coffins are with the mummy. We have texts relating to the history of the king, and also on these screens one can interact with some of the the CAT scans, the X-rays, and the other work that has been carried out scientifically. So you can learn more about the history of the king, as well as about the mummy, mummification. And so it's really sort of a much more integrated, multiple aspect of Egyptian history. Now, all of this is certainly bringing in much more in the way of tourism that is local. And one hopes that after Corona, this is going to be something that is going to spark more international tourism, because that is indeed one of the purposes for this. Now, there are some provincial museums that have also recently opened in the past 3 years, and these are part of the same push of extending sort of nationalism and also education, as well as, in some instances, not all, tourism, international as well as national. So it is interesting to see that with the provincial museums, in some cases, although there is still this push for economic well-being associated with them, there is also a push for the other aspect of museums, which is education. The Hurghada Museum, Hurghada is on the Red Sea, so this is a big place where tourists come for sun and fun. So it is more for the tourists, and in fact, it's designed to sort of titillate their interests and maybe get them to come back, not just for sun and fun, but to come to the Nile Valley and visit some of the antiquities of Egypt. So this is sort of a way of, it's a teaser. It's a little bit of a preview to get people interested. And it is less, I think it's less visited by the Egyptians who live in Hurghada, except for school groups. There is another museum in Sharm el-Sheikh, and Sharm el-Sheikh is another one of these. It's on the Red Sea. It's a great diving center. It's again sun and fun, but it is very well visited. And this one is going to be a much larger museum. It's only completed part of it, which is open. But the whole point is to, again, not just get people to come here when they're coming on their holidays, but to make people think, if there's this much here, let's go into the Nile Valley and look at more stuff. And interestingly, the residents of Sharm el-Sheikh themselves are quite pleased with their museum and do come and visit it quite a lot, which is quite charming. Now, the Kafr el-Sheikh Museum is in the Egyptian Delta, and this one, though, is not really made for tourists at all who are foreign. It is made primarily for Egyptian tourists. So it's in the middle of the Delta, and it's where to attract people from all over the Delta to come and see in one places, other than, Alexandria, which is other big center in the Delta, some of the wonders that ancient Egypt has. And this is it's primarily pharaonic again, and many of the artifacts come from the Delta area, but some come from further afield. And again, the idea is to educate, but also to create a sense of national pride, and a sense of linking people nowadays with the past. And that is indeed something that is happening a great deal, because when one listens to what people are saying and having them do things more on Facebook and Instagram and all of the other social media has really increased national interest in pharaonic as well as Islamic and Coptic past. And you are seeing more and more Egyptians becoming engaged with these different aspects of their heritage, and feeling a sense of unity based on this shared past, as well as feeling that these monuments need to be respected and cared for, because of course this is not just a past, this is also a financial future for their children, because tourism does figure prominently in everyone's lives. So museums nowadays do indeed do all the things that they ever did before, which is to have a focus on education, on protection of the past, in terms of material culture, in letting people have a sense of national pride and forging a national identity. And the added thing that now we have more than was historically associated with museums is their economic role in bringing in money into the country so that the rest of Egypt can in fact benefit from both the past and its present. So thank you very much for your attention.